Hello, my name is Christopher Calkins, and I'm an intern here at Sports Philanthropy Network. Thank you for joining us today for the sustainability panel. Now going to hand it over to Eugene, our moderator, to begin.
Good afternoon, folks. This is a fascinating topic. I am excited that we have two spectacular panelists this afternoon. We have Lew Blaustein and Blair Neelands. Lew has a background in sports marketing, but several years ago became fascinated with sustainability, started a blog, and has been writing that since 2013. At some point during the session, we will post the link to the blog in the chat function and allow him to talk about sustainability and the importance of climate change. Blair Neelands comes to us as the manager of community impact for the Portland Timbers and Thorns Football Club, where she is the leader of civic engagement, philanthropy, and environmental programs. She will be talking about the importance of integrating sustainability into the strategy of sports organizations. And I'd like to open it up and ask if each of them would just make a few statements right here at the beginning to get things rolling. And if I can ask Blair to get things started.
Sure. Thanks, Eugene. I'll say good morning, everyone. I join you from Portland, so it's 9 a.m. And it's already 90 degrees here, so it's incredibly appropriate that we're here talking about sustainability and the effects of climate change. So I work for the Portland Timbers and Thorns Football Club in our community impact department, where I've started to really grow our environmental programs from really just that, where it's a simple program that we do kind of one-off, to integrating it into our partnerships, into our education with fans and with youth in our community, and growing it from one-off events into really being a part of the fabric of our organization. So that's sort of just an overview. I'm excited to be here and chat with you all and share more, and to chat with Lew. So I'll throw it over to Lew.
All right, thanks, Blair, and thanks, Eugene, and also thank you for the folks who are joining us. So since 2013, I've been writing a blog about the intersection of green and sports called, not surprisingly called, Green Sports Blog, greensportsblog.com, as a matter of fact. And before that, I had worked in sports marketing and then had worked as a sustainability focused marketing, communications, and business development consultant. And so it just made sense. I asked myself, is there an intersection of green and sports? If there is, that would be really interesting to find out about and to write about. And then, and maybe I could, meet the people who are in this movement, which was really small back in 2013 and still small, but it has grown a lot. And so I've written about this topic for 8 years, from LEED certified stadiums to zero waste games to sports greenwashing and much, much more. And over time, I felt like while there was a lot of progress, I mean, the sports world has been greening at a rapid clip, especially if you focus mainly on the venues. LEED certification is expected now at some level, but most fans don't know about it. And the sports world doesn't do a good job in general, not saying putting the Thorns and the Timbers on the side in talking about it, but even more so, especially 2017, 2018, I'm thinking, why isn't the sports world talking about climate change? Because that's the real problem, the uber environmental existential threat that we face. And we're not, we use words like sustainability, green, but never climate, or rarely. And if we acknowledge that this is a massive problem, we're not doing much about it in terms of using the power of sports to get fans to care more about climate action, that's not good enough. So I decided that because I feel like athletes, more so than teams, move the needle. Athletes have led on a myriad of social issues, from civil rights to women's rights, to issues of war and peace, to LGBTQ rights, to all domestic violence, etc., but not so much on climate change. And so I thought that we needed an organization to help athletes feel comfortable and feel confident to speak out and lead climate action. And so that's how EcoAthletes, the nonprofit that I launched back a year ago, April, came to be. And that's ecoathletes.org. And I think that's enough to start. So I'll hand it back over to Eugene.
Well, why don't we start talking about some major issues within climate change? And I think what I really want to start with is we live here in the United States. Obviously, there's the United States for a period of time seems to have left the world consort handling that, and now seems to be climbing back in. So how does what the government does affect what you folks are doing in your space? And specifically, the U.S. government, but obviously the EU has played a lot in this space over the past, let's call it 4 years. Where does that affect you in what you're trying to do, what I'll call more locally within the sports industry?
You want to go first, Lew?
I'll start off on this.
I was trying to figure out which one to point at.
So I think that right now, I think that it's really a broad answer to a broad question, meaning that, to really make significant inroads on our carbon problem, all sectors of human endeavor need to be engaged on it. That means the business world, the philanthropic world, the institutional world, and government. They all have to be engaged on this. And you're right, the United States government at the federal level, especially, during the Trump administration, was absent. In fact, they were hostile. That's changed now. And so that's an important signal to businesses. Sports are businesses, and institutions, i.e. college sports, that, but it's just one signal, right? I'd say the bigger signal is that, if you look at polling, acceptance of climate change as being real and human caused. Last poll I saw, I think, was at 78% or 76% in the US, which is an all-time high. And as you get younger down the demographic, scale, where you're at millennials and especially Gen Z, I mean, it's not if it's real, it's what are you going to do about it? So I think that's another important signal. But I do think that there are policy prescriptions that sports teams and leagues could get behind or not, but that if instituted will have impacts. For example, carbon pricing. If a national carbon price is put into effect, which I think it will at some point, how will that impact the various industries that are called sports, from teams and leagues that put on games to sporting goods to da-da-da-da-da, and how would that benefit them potentially, and can they get behind it? So there are policy discussions that will have impacts on sports, but I think more broadly right now, it's really a signal, and the signal is in the right direction.
Blair?
Yeah, I'll say from our perspective, first at the national level with decisions that our government has or hasn't made in the last several years. They have impacted us, but there are ways that organizations, including ours, have kind of gone around it. With our removal from the Paris Climate Agreement, sports organizations started to sign on to the UN Sport for Climate Action, saying that, we signed on saying that we still as an organization are committing to all of these goals of reducing our carbon in accordance with that agreement. So it did have an impact, but several organizations in the sports world went around it. And I'll say, outside of that, we are more focused on our local government and what is at play at that level, just as a sports team. And we are very active in what's done here in Portland, as well as in our state, specifically with, like Lew mentioning, carbon pricing. We have been in conversations with our capital about how do we as a large business in our state support us moving forward and making big implementations for climate action in our state, while also listening to the people on the other side who have disagreements and have concerns about this. So it may not be publicized. It may not be something that we talk a ton about because, as Lew mentioned, we don't do a great job. Even teams that are doing a lot behind the scenes, you know, we talk a lot about just what happens on the pitch, but we are very involved from our municipality and their waste diversion, all the way up to talking with representatives at the UN as it pertains to climate action.
And I wanted to add one thing. And Blair, mentioned that that local action is also important. And there is a group called Protect Our Winters, which is actually a group of snow sports athletes. So think, Olympic and world champion level skiers and snowboarders. And now they've branched off or have added trail runners and climbers. So snow sports athletes and what we'll call adventure sports athletes or outdoors. And what they do is they train them and they go and they lobby members of Congress in Washington, but also in the states that are most, that where snow sports or where the snow sports industries or the outdoor sports industries are most affected. And they will go and lobby members of the state legislatures on behalf of climate legislation at that level. And so I think that it's really, you got to cover all the bases, federal all the way down to local.
So here's I guess the next question. And so one of the projects I'm currently working on, I'm actually sort of the side project manager for, is building 6 true net zero buildings. The first one being outside of the Philadelphia metro area. And I was shocked when I started this that there aren't actually any net zero buildings, especially residential, here in the United States. That was shocking to me. But you're both in the sports world. You're both targeting the sports world. I actually had this conversation with the owner of the Minnesota Vikings, and I said to him a few months ago, I said, what would it take for an actual team, an actual pro team, to build a net zero building? And when he was done laughing at me, and then asked me, he said, wow, I didn't know stuff was legal in North Carolina to smoke. And I reminded him that he was sitting in New Jersey where it was. I said to him, I said, why not? I said, you've got, 30 teams run by 30 of the wealthiest families in the world running sports teams. How much would it take to start creating net zero stadiums? So you're both involved in sports. Is that possible in any of the sports? Maybe a soccer stadium, which is more outside, versus a basketball stadium, which has all the blinking lights. But is something along those lines possible? Is it worth pushing these very wealthy Americans to take the lead and do something? I'll go with Blair.
Apologies, my dog decided to run in here.
I have a white dog.
That dog is fast.
That was, we saw a blur, but that was.
Oh yeah, it was his tail. My apologies. I mentioned it's 90 degrees already here, and I have one very small window unit, and we are all trying to to be in one room. So my apologies. Yeah, so achieving a true net zero. First of all, I think that's a daunting task. It's a lot easier said than done. I think we like to throw out a lot of these, being zero waste or net zero, and it's, first of all, there's a lot more that goes into it. Do I think it's achievable? I absolutely do. I would say, from my perspective, for the Timbers and Thorns, I don't know that we can. We have a building that we will probably never demolish and build over, which ultimately is, I believe, more sustainable, that we continue to stick with this 1926 building, that we continue to retrofit. And that's why I'm taking this from here, because air conditioning in a 1926 building is tough. But ultimately, your question is, can we achieve it? I think we can. And that's what we need going forward. And I think, just as Lew mentioned, a stadium 20 years ago receiving a LEED certification may have made news, and now it's expected, that you'll get LEED Platinum, and that's normal at this point. And my hope is that with the amount of money that's out there in sports, and the amount of interest and the influence of sports, that we will get there. And hopefully sports teams, that it'll be, no big deal, Climate Pledge Arena becomes the norm, is my hope. I don't know if you have a different opinion, Lew.
Well, I think on balance, I'm right with you, actually. It depends also what net zero, how you define it, right? Like, for example, is it just the operation of the building, or is it, where does fan travel come into it? And because fan travel is the biggest, if you were trying to calculate the emissions around a sports event, fan travel is the biggest component. So there you could encourage you could put EV charging stations in. You could, hopefully you have mass transit, and you provide incentives for coming to and from the game via mass transit. But, at a certain point, you're just going to be offsetting travel related emissions. And so I think it's certainly doable. I'm going to flip it a little bit. I actually think that if you're really, if we put so much emphasis on, trying to get emissions of the games themselves as close to zero, or to minimize them to maximize the minimizing, so to say, I actually think the emphasis is a little bit, that's off. Because what are we really trying to solve for? If we're really trying to use the power of sports to make a dent in carbon emissions, well, 99% of fans don't go to sports events. Most people consume sports on television or their phone, or old fogies like me might read a newspaper. I know that's such a kind of quaint notion.
I'm laughing a little bit, but I haven't had cable for close to a decade.
Right.
And I now consume sports, and for me, it's mostly New York Mets games, if it's free, and if it's on YouTube or Amazon.
Or on the radio.
In North Carolina, the only sports on the radio is basketball, and I really couldn't care less if I tried. Well, I guess I could care less, but it would be really hard. But yeah, no. So and I'm not typical, but yes, most people I know have, God only knows how many cable channels, and that's how they consume professional sports.
Right. So there are the sports. The actual greening of the games themselves was kind of like, the way I looked at it, green sports 1.0, right? That makes sense. If you're really going to do a greening of sports to affect change, well, first you have to, kind of green your front yard, your mega, you know, your crown jewel, which is the game, which are the games themselves. But if you dig into it, what we're really trying to do, I think, or we need to do, is to influence fans to make micro changes in their lives, and also to either band together or by collectivizing their voices independently of each other to make noise such that the decision makers, both in the government and in business, hear them and make policy changes, product changes, etc. Because you're talking about 2.5 to 3 billion people follow sports, and sports changes culture. So that, to me, is really where more of the focus is. Like, to me, if I want to make a difference, I don't necessarily know if I need to go that extra mile to get to net zero at the stadium. I want to get climate messaging on the Super Bowl on whatever network is broadcasting it, because that's where you're reaching the people.
So
Something like that.
Let's take that to the fans. I'm a Rutgers graduate who unfortunately joined.
Me too.
That's right. You're from New Jersey. I should have figured that out.
Are
so
you?
I Rutgers joined the Big Ten a few years ago, which we won't get into the politics of that. But if you look at Rutgers in Maryland, it's one thing for their football team to travel to Nebraska once every few years. It's an entirely another issue for their volleyball team, their rowing team, etc., to travel to the Midwest every Saturday for a match of some sort. The ACC, the Natural North Carolina schools, now go up to Pittsburgh, Boston College, in order to play what I'll call minor sports. Every single conference, with the possible exception of the Big West, don't ask me to start naming teams in that because I can't, travel great distances in order to play minor sports. Needless to say, there's not a lot of fans going that are traveling with them, but in some cases, certainly for football and basketball, there are. Should part of climate change within sports is telling conferences that the minor sports should play geographically friendly places and not within their own conferences? Would that be a step one to stop some of this? Lew, do you have an opinion? And no comment about Rutgers in the Big Ten unless you agree with me.
That's too. I'll put that on the side.
Okay.
But let's go RU. So I think you're onto something there, actually. But I think the ambition could even be bigger, because yes, the non-revenue sports, you could say that they're not generating enough revenue to make it worth expending those carbon emissions to travel to and from games. But I mean, is it really a revenue issue? Actually, what I think COVID provide the way Major League Baseball did it coming out of COVID last year provided a clue as to what sports could look like in a carbon constrained world, because Major League Baseball, because of during COVID, if you remember the 2020 season, they rejiggered the leagues, and instead of playing American League and National League and a couple interleague games, they just had the teams that were in the Eastern Seaboard play each other, and the teams in the central part of the country play each other, and the teams in the West play each other, to minimize travel because of COVID concerns on a number of different levels. And so they just did it. They literally just did it. And we're not there yet, but we're not also taking the action collectively so that we don't get there. But I think what you, Eugene, suggested is going to be something that's going to be much more It's going to go way beyond just minor sports and college athletics. If we're really in a carbon constrained world, you're going to have big time sports. You won't be seeing the Mets play the Dodgers. You'll be seeing the Mets play the Yankees and the Phillies or whatever, because of carbon constraints, unless we innovate ourselves to low carbon or zero carbon aviation fuel, which is something I think that if the sports world really wants to exist as it has, they should be championing that.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going to go with this is, as a major league, as two major leagues, on our women's side, we really struggle because other than OL Reign up the road a few hours, when our team travels to, Houston is one of the closer teams. And so we are traveling pretty far. And last year, due to COVID, we had the Challenge Cup in Utah, but then the fall series was very similar to Major League Baseball's look and feel, where we did a West Coast and an East Coast. And then ultimately, because of soccer assigning points in the way it does, though the two teams didn't even play each other. It was basically you have, the most points. And so you win. And ultimately, I'm a fan of this. I know that the teams may not have the same opinion. And that's where we've tried to implement the idea of climate action into our partnerships, because one of our largest partners is Alaska Airlines. And so having that conversation, I know me talking to someone at Alaska Airlines isn't going to flip a switch, but it at least gets some gears going, right? Of, this team is interested in this. And can we continue down this path of having cleaner fuel and leverage our partnerships with, Alaska Airlines has a partnership with, seems like every major sports team in the Pacific Northwest. So can they start there and help spread the word of something such as this? So I also love the idea of, the non-revenue generating sports doing something on neutral ground where it limits some of that. But I think it does go beyond having some larger conversations with major players in the industry for the pro leagues.
So Blair, I'm going to follow up on the Alaska Airlines concept, because they have a lot of control over airports and when buses come into airports. I know here in North Carolina, all three major basketball teams, Duke, UNC, and NC State, and yes, I include NC State in the comment, now have natural gas buses, so that if the players are traveling, I want to say it's within 100 miles or 200 miles, but basically if they're traveling what I'll put in quote locally, and again, non-revenue sports, God forbid a football team should ever get on a bus for more than 10 minutes. They're traveling in buses that are no longer fossil fuel. They switched over to natural gas. And the curiosity then becomes, could an Alaska Airlines, because they have all these partnerships, have enough power to say, if we're flying a team into someplace, we expect them to be picked up by a bus that is friendlier to the environment, or can they get? It's not a lot. It's not a big thing, but if they can get a little thing and get more companies, especially in transportation, starting to think about it. I mean, I know. I don't know what's going on at Rutgers. I know that at the Seton Hall Law School, the 4 buses they have are now eco-friendly. And exactly how that's defined, I don't know. Seton Hall is a pretty small campus. But that was done because the person who took over in their PR department came from a family that was very eco-friendly and made the suggestion when they were going to buy new buses, and someone did it. That's all it was. But I think about Alaska Airlines, which is a major corporation. They could ask for something small, and then it spreads.
Absolutely, leveraging that recognition and that power is necessary. I would say it's not so much on the Alaska Airlines side of things, but on us really. Like locally in the Pacific Northwest, we are a part of a coalition of sports venues, of public spaces such as the Oregon Zoo, the Seattle Aquarium, the conference centers in the area, that we are the ones who end up leveraging that transportation, for example, more. And so getting all of us in line to say, we want, eco-friendly, whether it's electric or natural gas, whatever it may be in your area, that this is what we all want. And so it's, again, going back to that partnership and really aligning it within every area of your business. Our contract with our local transportation providers, whether they're taking us to PDX Airport or driving us up to Seattle, we sign that deal. We take that into our hands. And so it's a conversation with our soccer operations staff to say, this is important to us to be better in every area. And this includes the bus business that we contract with. And so it's absolutely something that is doable, but I would say it's more on us as the team signing those deals rather than an Alaska Airlines. But it never hurts for someone with a name and the power of Alaska to throw their input in there.
And Lew, I guess curiosity, you live in the heart of the Big East. I think it's at the Bronx, so you're probably pretty close to St. John's. You're not too far from several of their other schools. Have you considered reaching out to a conference like that and said, this is what I'm working on? Have you made the attempt?
Oh, yeah. I mean, first of all, college athletics, big time college athletics has actually done some really important work and are leaders in some respects. The ones that the Pac-12 is to me head and shoulders above the others, and they even have it really started with the University of Colorado, which has, Boulder, Colorado. If you're thinking of a green place, that would be one of them. Portland, where Blair is another. But they're located in a place that already is positively disposed in the main to the environmental messaging. And so at Colorado, they started something called Ralphie's Green Stampede, Ralphie being the name of the buffalo. And that was basically, they created a platform of green branded sponsors that were part of Ralphie's Green Stampede, and it's been very successful. And then they just kind of expanded that to the rest of the Pac-12. Each school has not done their own equivalent of what Ralphie is, but they have done some major green programs at the league level and on the campus level. The student athletes get involved. They sell green themed sponsorships. And they're making some real efforts at reducing emissions on game days, et cetera. The ACC also has a sports sustainability. They've had sports sustainability conferences. The Big Ten was going to, but then COVID happened. And the Big Ten has done some good work, especially at Ohio State. And even the SEC, which you would not think of as a place where this could ferment. It actually has bubbled up at several places, including the University of Florida and Auburn. And the Big 12, I don't know anything about, of the Power Five. And as you asked me about the Big East at first, I don't know a lot about, a lot of this is driven by football. Big East is no longer a football conference. So anyway, there's a lot going on at colleges. I'll leave it there.
So I guess just from the standpoint, I am on the board of the Sports Philanthropy Network. I do know that they have a task force, or at least we were trying to get them to start building people on a task force. But one of the purposes of a task force, including, of course, making sure that the two of you are on it, is saying, we're going to go out to every major, I'm going to say more than just the Power Five, but the other conferences as well, that have football, that have, all sports, and try to get everyone involved in sustainability. I'm going to put into quotes one room. It's one Zoom room until next year's conference, which will be in person. But is that worth making the attempt?
I mean, I think yes. I mean, anything that gets a bigger group of sports decision makers together for real, with the potential for real change is a good thing. I think that if you were to do something like that, you would want to start with those who are already doing it and then figure out a way. And then figure out a way to cascade it. I mean, and I don't think it has to stay at the D1 level. I mean, I think D2 and D3 could be involved. And I'm guessing that many are doing it on campus already at a modest level.
I know some D3 teams, like I'll mention Alon, which is here, and it's a small school here in North Carolina. I think if there's 5,000 students, I'd be shocked. They're outside of, I want to say, Greensboro. They've got an entire sustainability that when they build a building now, it's got solar on the top. They're doing it. They're not announcing it. They're not making big waves about it, but they're doing it. Some other small schools that I know, as a matter of fact, well, it used to be called, I think it's called the College of New Jersey now. It's in Trenton.
Yeah, it used to be Trenton State.
Is that it? They've got their new buildings are all solar friendly.
Oh yeah, I mean,
some small schools are doing it. I don't know if those small schools within their sports programs are doing it. And the only reason that I know about the schools that are doing it, I mentioned I'm working on a net zero project that's more residential in the Philly area. They, in trying to find technicians and engineers that understood what we were working on, we were told go to the universities, and of course the universities didn't have them, and they said no, go to the small universities. So Lehigh University has an entire program in this, and they knew all the universities around the country that have net zero programs in operation. None of them are there, but at least they had a list, which was a gigantic leap. And of course, anyone who knows Lehigh is their sports teams are named the Engineers, so it sort of stood to reason that they would be a place to go for this. I didn't know that before I started the project. So here's a different question as we sort of change a little bit. The Olympics are coming up, I think 6 to 8 weeks from now, give or take.
3 weeks.
3 weeks, there you go, okay.
About 3 weeks, yeah.
I know the Olympics have a sustainability program. The fact that so many less people are coming internationally to the games can't help but can't hurt but help us, unfortunately, for the reason. Any thoughts about the Olympics this summer versus what's going on with the Olympics in what'll be 3 years from now, or probably 2 years from now for the winter? Any comments or thoughts there?
I'll start off. Well, I mean, this year is, the result, because fans from outside of Japan are not going to be able to go because of COVID, that travel related emissions, fan travel, is going to be like minuscule and compared to in other Olympic years. And so they will probably make the claim that they're the greenest Olympics of the modern era. And, you can't really refute that. I think that the Olympic movement is doing a lot of really good things. The IOC has a carbon negative goal. They are, and they're doing a lot of reductions of emissions. Of course, the IOC is really mainly the people in Switzerland at their office and other offices in the Olympic Channel. It's not the actual games themselves, but they certainly have influence over the host committees. And then the host committees after Tokyo, to be able to have gotten the games, you had to have agreed to some major sustainability targets that really have teeth. And that's why it's smart that they decided to go in the summer to Paris in 24 and Los Angeles in 28, where the facilities are largely built. So they don't have to build new stadiums and arenas and other venues. And so construction costs are going to be next to nil. Because these cities have had multiple Olympics and have huge sporting infrastructures already. And I think that they would be well served to tighten up the rotation of places where the Olympics go if they really want to keep to, you know, minimizing carbon emissions. But again, I go back to the idea of that's not even the game is getting the message out to the people watching. And in 2016 at the opening ceremonies in Rio, there was a climate vignette. I don't know if you saw it or remember it, but it, you know, as part of the opening ceremonies, they did a vignette on climate change at the Rio Stadium at Maracanã, and it got watched by potentially 1 billion people. That is the biggest audience for any climate messaging ever in history. And so that there needs to be more of that. And as for, you know, Beijing in 22, I don't know what fan travel is going to be like for that. So I can't speak to that yet.
I'm not really involved in the Olympic movement at all, though we have several Olympians headed to Tokyo. But I will say, having been involved in some of the conversations with the UN Sport for Climate Action, beyond the IOC, I do know that all the national governing bodies are also looking at this. You know, fan travel is all of our highest carbon impact, but outside of that, it's often our own travel. And that's what all the national governing bodies are seeing right now and saying, you know, if we're committing to climate action, then that's what we have to figure out. And I hate to say it again, but that's where their partnerships are key, is, you know, working with whomever their travel partner is, or, you know, spreading the word within their own country about it being important to them to reduce their carbon impact. We all know we all have to send athletes. You know, we're not going to not travel to the Olympics. You know, we can't do this over Zoom, but that doesn't mean you can't not try to reduce the impact somehow. And once you reduce it all, trying to offset in some way and communicating about that, because, you know, I think it often stops there, that we don't really share what we're doing, especially even if we're just offsetting, because it seems like, you know, it's the bare minimum we could do. But you know, the more people hear about, I feel like in the last few years, just the word offset has become more and more popular, and you start to hear this from many different avenues. And as an individual person, you get more intrigued and maybe try to look at, you know, I have a trip coming up to wherever, maybe I should try to do this, you know, and engaging people. And that trickles down to the fan travel to the Olympics. You know, my team from my country is offsetting their travel, and maybe I should as well, you know, while I'm here. So it's, I think it goes beyond that venue goal of being net zero, and into so many different other avenues, which make it just this complex beast to tackle.
So you both have a sort of a marketing background, a community impact background. Lew, I noticed when I was glancing at your blog that at some point you asked LeBron James to speak up, and whether he has or hasn't, I don't know. But here's the question for you. In every market, and however many teams there are, there's about 120 total, you know, major sports teams. Is there a method within community involvement from each one of them that if perhaps not the athletes, although NBA and NFL athletes would carry a lot, But if each one of those community professionals, everyone probably has a community manager or something, if they would put out on, say, one specific day, probably, I'm not going to suggest Earth Day, there's too much on Earth Day, but if every team would say, just say something, climate change is here, have some sort of event specifically for their fans and get people educated with that. Now, yes, it'd be great if LeBron James did it or Bo Jackson would do it. I'm gonna run out of, because I'm not a big fan, I'm gonna run out of people to call on, but I can come up with Russell Wilson since he went to NC State. But if every team did something, would that help, or does it have to be that one gigantic sports star like a LeBron James that has a voice that even I hear, even though I'm trying to ignore him? And of course, I bring up Tiger Woods, who actually owns a Tesla but doesn't drive it.
I mean, I can't. I'll just say that it's like, to me, it's all of the above. We really need the voices of athletes, and as big as they come, the better, to get behind the need for climate action and the benefits of climate action. You know, it can't all be gloom and doom, because it's not. This is an economic issue, this is a racial issue, and if we get on the right side of it, it becomes from economic injustice and racial injustice to economic justice and racial justice and climate justice. So we can get to the right side of it. However, what you're suggesting, Eugene, of course, now the thing is, a lot of clubs, and I'll hand it off to Blair, a lot of them do initiatives on Earth Day. So I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing that it gets concentrated on Earth Day. There's also something called Green Sports Day, which is a new thing, relatively speaking, started in 2016 through an organization that's Portland based, called the Green Sports Alliance, which is basically the trade group of the green sports world. And they got a presidential proclamation, and they, but it's really not well known. But I think if every team got around climate action around Green Sports Day, which is October 6th for those keeping score at home, that would also be a good thing.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that it takes all of the above. And I'd say from the sports team and the venue perspective, we have been doing an Earth Day, Green Game, something or other for years. And it's to the point where, at least from our perspective, it has to move on from April. It has to become something that we do all the time. And that's where, the Green Sports Day has helped, because now we can do something in April and something in October. But now, our Green Game has become a sponsorable event. And when they ask when it can be, I say any time of the year. It shouldn't be one of, 30 some odd games we have in the venue.
It's just like, Blair, I don't know if you guys are involved in this, and Eugene, I don't know if you're aware of it, but Adidas has partnered with a nonprofit called Parlay for the Oceans. And Parlay for the Oceans basically collects plastic ocean waste, fish nets, and all the stuff that's polluting our oceans, and they turn it into apparel. And so, and Adidas partners with Parlay, and they use those fabrics that come from the ocean waste and turn it into uniforms, jerseys, and also sneakers. And some teams have one game, like the University of Miami football has a green game where they wear the Parlay jerseys. And I'm like, why not wear the Parlay jerseys all the time? Because then when you're only doing it once, you're just making it seem like, oh yeah, this is cute, we're doing this green thing, here's something to sponsor, blah, blah, blah. but it just seems it's not enough, and they're already doing it, for goodness sakes. So I don't know if you guys are involved with that, but I think it should be parlay jerseys all the time if you're an Adidas team. Obviously.
Absolutely. We do. We just had our parlay game May 30th. So it was around World Ocean Day, which is, again, like, okay, now we have 3 days a year that we recognize. But to your point, it should be every game that we have these kits that are made of ocean plastic, and we shout it from the rooftops.
Yeah, and you can have, I mean, you should have, here I'm telling you, let me retire that word. You could have a parlay Adidas day, but wear the uniforms all season long.
Right.
The
right.
two are not mutually exclusive.
Absolutely. And then back to the original question about, someone like LeBron James jumping on this versus all the teams doing it. I think we've seen a similar instance play out when it comes to racial equity and athletes talking about this. And, when it's only 1 or 2, they get outcast. But as soon as the teams as a whole are standing together and the organizations are backing them, and it becomes the true fabric of what the organization as a whole is about, that's when, the message is getting hit in many different avenues. And that's not to say some people don't turn their ears off when it's being said, but it can't just be one green game or one game in February dedicated to Black History Month. It has to be something that we talk about all the time. So yes, it would be beneficial for a LeBron James to say something about climate action, but it's more than just him.
Fair enough. We're coming up upon the hour, so I'm going to ask you to each spend a couple of minutes just in closing, and then I will close the session after you've done. So maybe Blair, just 2 minutes on, for you, what's next and what you're working on, and anything that we completely missed.
Yeah, so I know I stated it at the start, but Portland is, and the Pacific Northwest as a whole right now, it's so appropriate to have this conversation. The last 2 days we've set a record in temperature in this region, and we're about to set it again today. And so it's incredibly important. And we've had the Olympic trials happening down the street in Eugene. During this time, our Timbers match got moved back to an 8:30 p.m. kick, and it was still over 90 degrees at kickoff. And when you add in the temperature of the pitch, now we truly see the impact of climate change on sports. It's not just we have an impact on climate change, but it's hitting us. And so it's such a relevant discussion. I know that there has been a group of pioneers talking about this for many years, and it is growing, but it needs to continue to grow, and we do need to continue to have these discussions. And for me, what's next? Currently, I'm doing exactly what I was preaching about partnerships. We're trying to integrate a zero waste plan with a partner that goes beyond just our waste hauler and us trying to make sure recyclables end up in the recycling container and the basic level, because it's harder than you would think, especially after you have a few beers at a game. Just throw it in the trash can, right? But taking it beyond that and having an understanding of where our waste actually goes when it leaves our venue, because we could sit here and say that we're zero waste, but the waste all ends up at the landfill at the end of the day. So being truly involved in that process, and so that's one example of something we're working on. Lew posted a blog article about a carbon offset initiative that we launched earlier this year around Earth Day. Right now, we're offering our fans carbon offsets through our online merchandise. That's just the tip of the iceberg for us to offset any shipping impact of our merchandise going wherever in the world, because we have Thorns fans all over the world, and extending that into offering it for our fans tickets. And so trying to address that major concern of our fans traveling from far and wide coming to our venues, that if we didn't have a game where we could accept fans, this carbon emission wouldn't happen. And so how can we try to strategically approach this and implement something that will combat that impact? So that's sort of what's next, is trying to grow that from our merchandise into our tickets. I'm sure I'm missing a major program, but that's a gist of what we have going on in the future here.
And Lew, you want to take a couple of minutes before we end?
Sure. And first of all, kudos to what Blair has done and is doing with the Timbers and the Thorns. They're doing it, and she has the desire to make green and climate action permeate through the team's operations, not just on one day or 2 days, which is a must. So where I'm coming from is I'm actually trying to do what I can through EcoAthletes, which is to get athletes to use their platforms to lead climate action, to go big, because I understand it makes sense, right, to want to go incrementally, and we have to, because big change can be disquieting. But the physics tells us that we don't have a lot of time. And in 2018, when Mike Trout signed his 12-year contract extension for $500 million or $400 million, whatever it was at the time, everybody focused on, wow, that's $400 million. I focused on, that's 12 years. And that was the same amount of time that the UN IPCC, which is the group of climate scientists collectively that makes a kind of state of the climate report every 1 or 2 years, that said that by 2030, in 2018 they said this, humanity has to decarbonize by 45% to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, basically the length of Mike Trout's contract. And that was like the aha moment for me. So I'm trying to think and then push in my own little way the actions that could be big, i.e., zero carbon, low carbon aviation fuel, and have sports be a leader in pushing that with partners, could be Alaska Airlines. Anyway, and we're looking to grow. So EcoAthletes, we now have 40 EcoAthletes champions, athletes from all over the world who endorse our mission, push out our climate comeback hashtag, because sports are where comebacks happen. And we're growing that. And thank you for this opportunity to share this important topic.
Fair enough. Thank you both to Blair and Lew, as well as to Randy and Chris for being the helpers from the Sports Philanthropy Network today. This session was recorded and will be posted on social media, as well as, I believe, the Sports Philanthropy Network YouTube channel. In addition, I will be making sure, my brother has actually been in this space for 40 years as a professor and as a scientist at Waste Management. And I will be making very sure that he and his network listen to it, because they, in fact, have the contacts in this space that can probably help. Thank you again for attending, and I'll turn it back over to you, Randy.
I wanted to thank everybody for attending and participating. I love hearing all you guys' stories about your work, and look forward to seeing what you guys have to do in the future.